The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical prayer above the night shift at Sacred Heart Hospital in Savannah, casting everything in that particular shade of white that made 3 a.m. feel like the end of the world. Margaret Walsh moved through the corridors with the kind of quiet that comes from practice, not the quiet of shyness, but the quiet of someone who had learned long ago that the less noticed you were, the longer you survived. Her name tag read simply M. Walsh, RN. Nothing else. No first name. No credentials. Just the bare minimum required by hospital policy, which suited her fine. She'd been working the night shift at Sacred Heart for 3 years now. 3 years of arriving at 10:45 p.m., checking the assignment board, taking the cases no one else wanted, the difficult patients, the ones who coded at midnight, the confused elderly men and women who needed someone to hold their hand while their bodies decided whether to keep fighting. Margaret had become invisible in the way that only night shift nurses can become invisible. She existed in the margins of the hospital's consciousness. Day shift nurses didn't know her name. Residents didn't call her for her opinion. Attending physicians moved past her as if she were part of the furniture. The hallway smelled like antiseptic and floor wax that never quite covered the underlying smell of sickness, that particular combination of sweat and medications and the kind of fear that comes with hospital gowns and monitors. The medication cart wheel squeaked as she pushed it down the corridor, and she felt her shoulders tense slightly at the sound. Too close to the axles of a Humvee. Too close to convoys she'd learned to identify by the particular pitch of their engines. She breathed through it. 3 years of night shifts had taught her how to breathe through things. In her locker at the back of the break room, hidden behind her spare scrubs and a single paperback novel she read in fragments across her lunch breaks, sat a pair of combat boots. The leather was worn soft in places from years of wear, cracked in others from desert heat and then the shock of air-conditioned barracks. Dust from Helmand Province still worked its way into the treads if you looked closely enough, red dust that seemed determined to travel 18,000 miles to haunt a woman who was trying very hard not to be haunted. The boots had no business being there. Hospital policy was clear about footwear. But Margaret had learned that some things were worth the small risk of breaking rules. The boots were a reminder. Not of glory. She'd never wanted glory. They were a reminder of who she used to be, before the weight of every life she couldn't save had accumulated in her chest like scar tissue, before PTSD had broken her into pieces she was still assembling in the dark hours between midnight and dawn. 3 tours. 12 years of service. 127 combat saves across multiple deployments and operational theaters. A senior chief petty officer in a branch of the military that most people only remembered existed when they thought about lighthouse keepers or that one commercial with the perfect rescue. She didn't think about that anymore. That was the whole point of being Margaret Walsh at night shift at Sacred Heart. To not think about it. To be someone else. Someone smaller. Someone safe. Her grown daughter didn't know where she was. That was the part that still cut deepest when Margaret let it, which she didn't, not anymore. She'd left in the night 7 years ago, changed her name on documents that didn't need to match anything official, and disappeared into the kind of anonymity that only a large hospital system could provide. Her daughter was lieutenant commander now. Naval aviator. Doing everything Margaret had done and probably doing it better. The irony of both of them serving and neither of them knowing about the other was the kind of joke the universe seemed to enjoy. Margaret had made peace with that. Or close enough to peace. Peace was probably too strong a word. She moved through her shift with the invisible efficiency of someone who had done this exact thing 5,000 times before. For lines were changed with hands that moved like they were reading a script written into her muscle memory. Vital signs were checked and documented. An elderly man in room for 12 was having anxiety about his surgery. She sat with him for 15 minutes without speaking, just present, and something about her presence seemed to calm him more than any medication could have. That was the thing about being invisible. Sometimes people told you their truths because they didn't think anyone was listening. Tuesday morning brought Dr. Hargrove down to the unit before the day shift had even started. He was tall in the way that came from generations of good nutrition and expensive boarding schools, with the kind of jawline that seemed designed to cut glass. His white coat was pristine. His shoes were polished. Everything about Dr. Hargrove announced that he had never spent a day wondering where his next meal was coming from, and Margaret found herself instantly, irrationally grateful that the night shift would be ending in 20 minutes, that she wouldn't have to see much of him. She was wrong about that. The code came in at 6:02 a.m., just as the night shift was supposed to be signing over to day shift. The trauma alert came through the radio, a male, 58, blunt force trauma, ETA for minutes. By the time the patient hit the trauma bay, half the hospital had converged on the space. Margaret was already there because she'd been checking on a post-op patient when the alert came through, and she'd simply stayed. She was good at these. Something about the controlled chaos of a code felt more honest to her than the quiet of the regular floor. The patient came in on a stretcher moving at a run, paramedics calling out vitals that were already dropping, blood pressure 94/58, dropping, heart rate 128 and climbing, respiratory rate elevated, O2 sat at 91% and falling. Dr. Hargrove was suddenly present, suddenly the center of the universe, suddenly shouting orders in that particular tone of voice that emergency room physicians seemed to think made them sound more authoritative. He ordered labs, ordered imaging, ordered someone to set up for a possible emergency thoracotomy. Everything was chaos and precision at the same time. Everything was protocol and experience colliding at 70 miles an hour. Margaret was standing to the left of the trauma bay, watching the monitors, listening to the numbers that told the story of a human body in rebellion. The patient's breathing was shallow. His O2 sat kept dropping despite the oxygen they were pushing into him. She knew what was happening. She could see it in the way his chest was rising unequally, in the way the right side of his body seemed disconnected from the left. Tension pneumothorax. A collapsed lung that was compressing his heart. She'd seen this before. She'd treated this before. She'd saved lives from this before. When Dr. Hargrove ordered chest X-rays and CT imaging, Margaret heard herself speak. The voice that came out was careful, respectful, nothing like the voice of someone making a diagnosis. But the words themselves were unmistakable. Tension pneumothorax, she said quietly. Right side. He needs a needle decompression now. The imaging will kill him. The trauma bay went silent for exactly 2 seconds. 2 seconds in which Dr. Hargrove's head turned toward her like a predator that had just noticed movement in the grass. 2 seconds in which every other person in the room continued working as if she hadn't spoken. Excuse me. Dr. Hargrove's voice was very soft. Very dangerous. Right second intercostal space, midclavicular line, Margaret said. She kept her voice level. She kept her hand still. A 14-gauge angiocath needle. 60 seconds, maximum. Or we're going to lose him. Dr. Hargrove stared at her. He was the chief of surgery. He was the one who made decisions at Sacred Heart. He was the one who had climbed his way up through a careful network of board connections and political maneuvering, the one who had cultivated relationships with the hospital administrators and the medical school faculty and the right kind of donors. He was the one who was supposed to be right. And he had just been questioned, corrected, actually, by a night shift nurse in front of 2 residents, a medical student, and the entire trauma team. Get her a 14-gauge, he said, but his jaw was tight. His eyes never left hers as the needle went in, as the air hissed out of the patient's chest, as the oxygen saturation climbed from 78 to 84 to 91 to 96 to 98%. The heart rate dropped. The blood pressure climbed. The patient went from dying to stable in less than 2 minutes. The room went back to controlled chaos. Orders were called out. The patient was stabilized and sent upstairs to ICU. Dr. Hargrove never spoke to Margaret again during the code. When it was finished, he simply walked out of the trauma bay, and Margaret watched him go with the particular calm that comes from knowing, with absolute certainty, that she had just made a very powerful enemy. The night shift ended at 7 a.m. Margaret changed out of her scrubs and into the clothes she kept in her locker, jeans, a faded t-shirt, a jacket that had seen better days. She reached past her spare scrubs, past the paperback novel, and her fingers brushed against the worn leather of the combat boots. She didn't pull them out. She just needed to know they were there. She needed to know that somewhere, even here, some small piece of who she used to be was still intact. It wasn't until she was walking out to the parking lot that she heard Dr. Hargrove's voice from the direction of the nurse's station, carrying through the hallway with the kind of volume that was clearly meant to be heard. He was talking to someone, probably one of the residents, probably someone young enough to be impressed by authority. She slowed her pace, though she didn't stop walking. "I'll make you all a bet," he was saying, and Margaret could hear the smile in his voice. "That new night shift nurse, Walsh, she'll quit within a week. Won't be able to handle the pressure. Night shift breaks people like that. They're not built for the real work." She kept walking. She didn't turn around. She didn't flinch. But something in her chest had gone very still, the way an animal goes still when it realizes the predator has noticed it. That tremor in her chest didn't fade when Margaret clocked out at 7 in the morning. It followed her to the parking lot, settled into her shoulders like a weight she couldn't shrug off. She'd survived Helmand Province. She'd held a Marine's intestines inside his abdomen while a mortar round landed 3 meters away. But this slow, calculated humiliation felt different. It was like watching a predator circle, knowing exactly when it would strike. The next shift came too fast. Margaret arrived at 6:13 p.m. for the evening rotation, and by 8:15, Dr. Hargrove had already positioned himself at the center of the nurses' station like a general claiming conquered territory. He had his usual entourage with him, 3 residents in white coats and the charge nurse, Dana, who always laughed a half-beat too late at his jokes. Margaret was entering vitals into the computer when she heard her name spoken like a curse. "Invisible Walsh," Hargrove announced, his voice carrying across the station with the precision of someone who'd spent a decade training people to listen. "I've been thinking about our little bet. $50 says you don't make it through next week." One of the residents grinned. Another pulled out his phone like he was recording a TikTok. Dana made a small noise that might have been sympathy or might have been agreement. Margaret didn't look up from the keyboard. Her hands kept moving. Enter. Tab. Enter. Tab. She wouldn't give him the reaction he was hunting for. Hargrove waited. The silence stretched. And when she still didn't respond, he turned to his audience instead. "The thing about nurses like this is they think they understand medicine. They've watched enough Grey's Anatomy, and suddenly they're doctors. It's almost cute." Laughter. The sound of it made something in Margaret's solar plexus tighten, but her shoulders stayed level. Her breathing stayed even. 2 days later, the cafeteria at 3:14 a.m. The hospital quieted at night in a way day shift never experienced, the emergency rooms and ICUs still humming, but the administrative wing going ghost quiet, the hallways becoming something closer to peaceful. Margaret sat alone at a table in the corner, just her and a bowl of tomato soup, saltines on a side plate. The break room was empty. She preferred it that way. The doors to the cafeteria swung open. Hargrove entered with 2 other surgeons, both talking about a case in the OR. They were discussing complications, standard surgical post-mortem. Margaret wasn't listening. She was thinking about the patient in 412, acute kidney injury, probably sepsis, probably going to code within 48 hours unless someone caught the early signs. She was thinking about the next shift, about whether she'd have time to check on him before clocking out. Hargrove walked past her table. Slowed. And then, without breaking stride, he extended his arm and knocked the entire tray off the edge of the table. The bowl went airborne. Soup arced through the air like a golden parabola before it hit Margaret's chest and lap, splashing across her scrubs in a spreading stain of tomato and broth. The bowl clattered onto the tile floor and shattered. The sound of breaking ceramic echoed in the cafeteria like a gunshot in a canyon. His 2 colleagues laughed, genuine, surprised laughter. One of them said, "Jesus, Hargrove." But neither of them stopped walking. They just kept moving toward the exit, moving away from the mess, moving like this was normal, like watching a man destroy a woman's meal was just another Tuesday night at Sacred Heart. Margaret sat very still. The soup was hot. It was already cooling on her skin, the heat beginning to wick away into the fabric. She looked up at Hargrove, and something in her eyes must have made him pause, because he did, just for a moment. He stopped walking. He looked back at her. A single tear formed in the corner of her right eye. Just one. It rolled down her cheek with the precision of a trained response, the kind of tear that comes not from pain or humiliation but from something much deeper, from the sheer exhausted weight of choosing not to destroy a man when you had been trained, extensively and repeatedly, in exactly how to do so. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact. The gesture was slow. Deliberate. When her hand came down, her expression hadn't changed. Her voice came out quiet enough that only he could hear it. "I've seen better men than you crumble under less pressure." Hargrove's jaw tightened. For just a moment, something flickered across his face, not anger, something stranger. Uncertainty. Fear, maybe. But he recovered fast, turned away, and pushed through the cafeteria doors with his colleagues, and they were gone. Margaret sat in the wreckage of her meal for another 3 minutes. Then she stood, grabbed paper towels from the dispenser, and cleaned it up herself. Her scrubs were stained. Her hands were steady. She'd cleaned up worse than soup. She'd cleaned up blood, tissue, the aftermath of IEDs that had turned men into something unrecognizable. This was nothing. This was a man playing dominance games with someone he didn't understand. But the weight in her chest didn't get lighter. 48 hours. That was all the space between that cafeteria and the next escalation. The hospital's third-floor hallway, 4:33 p.m., Margaret reviewing the discharge summary for a post-op patient named Maria Santos, 67, recovering from a routine cholecystectomy. The chart was thick with lab work and nursing notes. She was reading the recommendation for home care coordination when footsteps approached from behind, fast, purposeful footsteps she recognized immediately. Walsh. Not a question. A command. She turned. Dr. Hargrove was walking with the hospital's chief financial officer, a woman named Kessler who wore blazers that probably cost more than Margaret's monthly rent. They were mid-conversation about budget allocations, something about the surgical wing's procurement costs. Hargrove didn't slow down. He extended his arm and threw the chart he was holding directly at her feet. The chart hit the tile floor and exploded, pages scattering like confetti, lab reports sliding across the polished surface, notes and images spreading outward in a circle of chaos. "Pick that up, sweetheart," Hargrove said, his voice pitched for casualness, for the tone of someone giving a small order to a subordinate. "That's about your speed, cleaning up messes." Kessler made a small noise, something between disapproval and discomfort. She didn't stop walking. Neither did Hargrove. Margaret knelt slowly. The motion was controlled, measured, the way someone moves who has learned that speed gives away emotion. She began gathering pages, stacking them in logical order, her hands moving through the work with the kind of efficiency that comes from repetition. Patient demographics. Lab results. Surgical notes. Discharge recommendations. Each page returned to its place. Her heart was moving faster than her hands, but her hands didn't know that. They just worked. She stood. The chart was reassembled. She'd done a neater job than it probably arrived in. Hargrove had stopped 20 feet down the hallway and turned back, probably expecting her to call after him or ask him to wait. Instead, Margaret walked toward him and extended the chart. He took it, surprised by her composure, by the fact that she'd completed the task without complaint or emotion. Then she met his eyes. Held them. And a single tear escaped her left eye. Just one, the same as before, the tear of a woman at the very edge of something but not past it. She wiped it away without looking away from his face. "You're trying very hard to make me quit," she said quietly. "Why do you think that is?" Hargrove leaned closer, close enough that she could smell his cologne mixed with surgical soap. "Because you don't belong here, invisible. You don't belong anywhere." He walked away. But something in that moment had shifted. His voice had carried a note of something that wasn't quite anger. It was something closer to desperation, the sound of a man who'd expected her to break and found instead that she was made of something much harder than he'd anticipated. That night, Margaret sat in her car in the hospital parking lot for 23 minutes without starting the engine. The parking lot was poorly lit, just rows of vehicles under amber sodium lights, and the rain had started, light rain that made everything smell like wet asphalt and rust. She had her hands on the steering wheel and her forehead against her hands, and she was breathing in a way that suggested she was counting the breaths. Her apartment was a studio in a building with no character, chosen specifically for that reason. Nothing distinctive. Nothing that could be traced. She'd paid 6 months' rent in cash, given a false reference, used a name that wasn't quite her own but was close enough to answer to. The lease was in Margaret Walsh, but the Margaret Walsh who'd lived in Savannah for 3 years was a carefully constructed fiction, someone without a past, without connections, without the weight of Helmand Province and 127 combat saves and a daughter in the Coast Guard who thought her mother had abandoned her. She sat on the edge of her bed in the dark for an hour. No television. No phone calls. Just the sound of rain against the window and the weight of her silence. This was the cost of her disappearance, the right to be left alone, paid for with the price of being invisible. She'd chosen this. 3 years ago, when the nightmares had become something that threatened to consume her whole, when she'd realized that staying would eventually destroy everyone around her, she'd chosen this. But there was something about being deliberately erased that felt different from the relief she'd expected. It felt like drowning in a very slow way. Margaret changed out of her stained scrubs and set them in the sink to soak. The tomato soup had left orange streaks across the fabric. She looked at her hands under the bathroom light, steady hands, hands that had performed needle decompressions and battlefield amputations and held patients' fingers as they died. Hands that could do terrible things very precisely. Hands that, for 3 years, had been carefully kept in a place where they wouldn't be asked to do anything at all. She pulled on a shirt and a pair of sweatpants and stood at her apartment window. Savannah at night looked like a painting someone had left half-finished. The squares were lit with amber streetlights, the moss hanging from the oak trees like the remnants of something that had died slowly. This city had given her anonymity. It had also given her solitude so complete that sometimes she wasn't sure she still existed. In 12 hours, she would return to Sacred Heart. In 16 hours, an emergency would arrive. In exactly 18 hours and 47 minutes from this moment, a Coast Guard commander would be wheeled into the trauma bay with injuries that would send most surgeons into a controlled panic. And she would be there, in her scrubs, performing a procedure that would mark her as something other than invisible. But she didn't know that yet. Right now, she just sat in the dark and let the weight of her buried identity press down on her shoulders like a physical thing. Outside, the rain continued to fall. The rain kept falling, and Margaret kept breathing, and somewhere between the two she heard the overhead speakers crackle to life. Code activation. Multiple incoming from a Coast Guard helicopter crash, ETA for minutes. All trauma teams to stations. This is not a drill. The words hit her like cold water. She was still in her apartment, still sitting in the dark, still wearing civilian clothes. The rain hammering against the windows wasn't a metaphor anymore, it was a clock. For minutes. She moved on instinct older than her civilian life. The apartment blur became motion. Scrubs. Badge. Hair into a knot. The drive to Sacred Heart took 7 minutes, which meant the patients were already arriving when she pulled into the parking lot, tires spraying water onto the asphalt that gleamed black and endless under the sodium lights. The ER was controlled chaos. Not panic, Sacred Heart's night team had seen worse, but the kind of choreographed urgency that meant lives were being counted and sorted and assigned. Nurses moved between bays, equipment was being prepped, blood was being typed and crossed. The air smelled like antiseptic and the metallic copper of emergency, that sharp tang of adrenaline that every healthcare worker on the planet recognized without thinking. Walsh. It was Dr. Patel, the night shift attending, his voice cutting through the noise like a scalpel. Trauma Bay 2. Coast Guard Commander, primary mechanism blunt force trauma with possible tension pneumothorax. You've got 90 seconds before he arrives. Margaret nodded and moved. Trauma Bay 2 was already prepped, ventilator standing by, crash cart positioned, for lines laid out in their precise rows like surgical instruments. She checked the 14-gauge needles on the crash cart. Tested the defibrillator pads. Confirmed the oxygen was running at full flow. Her hands moved with the muscle memory of someone who had done this not in a hospital, but in a field hospital in Helmand Province while mortar rounds fell like rain, and the difference between 90 seconds and death was the angle of a needle and the steadiness of hands that refused to shake. The paramedics arrived with a kind of speed that meant the patient was already failing. The stretcher came through the doors like a missile, wheels squeaking against wet tile, and on it was a man in a Coast Guard uniform, his chest moving in irregular gasps, his skin the color of someone whose blood wasn't staying inside his body where it belonged. 42-year-old male, Commander Robert Riker, ejected from a Sikorsky during a patrol, the paramedic reported, already moving, already speaking in the clipped shorthand of people who had been running on adrenaline for 11 minutes straight. Lost pressure at the scene. Bilateral breath sounds diminishing. BP started at 128/72. Now it's 89/54 and tanking. O2 sat was 94 on scene. We're getting 78% now even with high-flow oxygen. Dying. The commander was dying in real time, his body shutting down because air had gotten into his chest cavity and was collapsing his lungs from the inside. It was one of the most correctable emergencies in trauma medicine and also one of the fastest killers if no one moved. Dr. Hargrove appeared at the bay entrance, still buttoning his shirt, clearly roused from sleep by the overhead announcement. He began barking orders that Margaret already knew were wrong. Get him on the monitor. 2 large bore 4s. Push fluids while we get him upstairs for imaging. Imaging. Imaging would take 10 minutes. The commander had maybe 5. Margaret didn't think. There was no space for thinking, no room for the calculations that hesitation required. She moved to the crash cart and her hand closed around a 14-gauge angiocath needle, the same needle she had used in a tent in Sanjan Valley while a Taliban round punched through the canvas wall and a young Marine's lung had collapsed and she was the only person between him and death. She located the second intercostal space at the mid-clavicular line on the commander's chest with her fingers, felt the anatomical landmarks beneath her touch as clearly as if they were printed on his skin. The needle went in. Smooth. Practiced. The kind of insertion that could only come from hands that had done this under fire, under pressure, under the absolute knowing that if the angle was wrong by even half a centimeter, the patient died. The hiss of air escaped the needle. Tension pneumothorax, confirmed. The pressure that had been crushing Commander Riker's lungs released like a valve opening. His oxygen saturation immediately began climbing. 78%. 82%. 88%. The improvement was visible on the monitor, a line climbing like a heartbeat returning to the world. Dr. Chen, the anesthesiologist who had just arrived at the bay, stared at Margaret's hands. Not at her face. Not at her badge. At her hands. At the angle of insertion, at the way she had maintained pressure while withdrawing, at the kind of precise, economical movement that belonged to someone who had learned this technique not in a simulation or a classroom but in a place where there were no second chances, where the difference between breathing and suffocation was the space between heartbeats. His eyes widened. Something flickered in his expression, recognition, alarm, and then a question forming behind his eyes. "I know that technique," he said quietly. The words were barely audible beneath the ventilator alarm and the monitor beeping and the general chaos of a trauma team moving into overdrive. But they carried weight. They carried the specific knowledge of someone who had been in field hospitals, who had learned procedures from people who had learned them the hard way. "Where did you serve?" Margaret's hand stilled. She had been moving to step back from the bedside, to cede control to Dr. Hargrove and the surgical team, but those 7 words stopped her like a physical force. The bay seemed to narrow around her. The sounds became distant, the ventilator, the monitors, the paramedics still reporting vitals, all of it fell away into background noise. She met Dr. Chen's eyes for exactly 1 second. In that fraction of time, she made a choice. The choice was visible in her face, a woman deciding whether to lie or to let something that had been buried for 3 years start to claw its way toward the surface. "I don't know what you mean," she said, and turned back to the monitors. But her voice had changed. Something in the timbre of those 6 words carried the weight of authority, not the careful deference of a night shift nurse, but the controlled tone of someone used to being obeyed. Someone used to command. Dr. Chen heard it. His expression shifted into something that looked like shock. Commander Riker was stabilizing. His blood pressure was rising. His oxygen saturation had climbed to 92% and was continuing to climb. The immediate threat to his life had been neutralized by hands that moved with the precision of someone who had done this not once but dozens of times, in conditions that made a trauma bay look like a sanctuary. Dr. Hargrove's face had gone rigid. The flush started at his neck and climbed toward his hairline, the specific flush of a man whose authority had just been circumvented by someone he had dismissed 3 days ago with a bet made in front of his entire surgical team. "You just performed a procedure without my authorization," he said, his voice tight and controlled in a way that made it more dangerous than if he had shouted. "That's grounds for immediate suspension." Margaret was already moving toward the scrub sink, already peeling off her gloves. She turned back to face him, and there was something in her posture that hadn't been there before, something like a door opening to a room that had been sealed for 3 years. "The patient was dying," she said simply. "You can file whatever paperwork you need." The commander was moved to ICU, stable and breathing. The immediate crisis had passed. But Dr. Hargrove was already in the hallway, already on his phone, and Margaret heard fragments of his conversation echo back through the ER doors. "Board members, credential review. I want her file audited immediately, call her references, yes, all of them, and find out where those combat boots in her locker came from." The boots. Her boots. Dr. Chen found her at the scrub sink, washing blood that wasn't hers from hands that had done this before, hands that carried the muscle memory of Helmand Province and Sanjin Valley and all the things she had tried to leave behind in an apartment that smelled like rain and loneliness. "Where did you serve?" he asked again, quieter this time. Almost gentle. The kind of question that came from someone who understood the weight of secrets kept, of identities hidden, of people who walked through the world in disguise so complete that even their own hands became a liability. Margaret's hand stilled under the running water. Soap and blood and antiseptic swirled down the drain in pale pink spirals. "I don't know what you mean," she repeated, but this time there was no conviction in it. This time it sounded like a lie they both could hear shattering. The silence between them lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then a nurse called out, the monitors beeped, the night continued, and Margaret Walsh stood at the sink with water running over hands that had just saved a life and destroyed the last 3 years of her invisibility in a single precise moment. Within 24 hours, Dr. Hargrove activated his entire network. Golf outings. Campaign donations. Political favors cultivated over a decade of handshakes and whispered promises in country club locker rooms. He picked up his phone and made 3 calls. The first was to board member Harrison Pierce, whose orthopedic practice Hargrove had steered referrals toward for 7 years. The second was to board member David Rothstein, whose daughter had interned in surgery under Hargrove's mentorship. The third was to board member James Bancroft, who owed him a favor from the last credentialing review when Hargrove had quietly buried a complaint about Bancroft's prescribing practices. By hour 16, Hargrove had contacted the nursing references listed on Margaret's hiring paperwork from 3 years ago, all from civilian facilities, all showing no military service, all conveniently stating they no longer had records of employment that far back. By hour 22, he had brought in an outside investigator, a forensic credentialing specialist from a firm that specialized in credential fraud cases. Patient safety concerns, Hargrove told the hospital attorney. "We need to verify her qualifications." The investigator arrived on a Tuesday morning carrying a leather briefcase and a mandate to audit Margaret's entire employment history for irregularities. By hour 36, Margaret was summoned to the administrative office on the 3rd floor. The tone of the message was different this time. Not a request. It wasn't a request. The chief nursing officer was present. The hospital attorney was present. A woman Margaret didn't recognize sat with a notebook, introduced as the external investigator. And Dr. Hargrove sat at the head of the table with a binder in front of him, thick enough to hold a patient's entire medical history. His smirk was already in place before Margaret sat down. The fluorescent lights buzzed their mechanical hum above them, that sound like insects trapped in plastic. The attorney opened with the official suspension notice, read in a measured voice that made everything sound both inevitable and reasonable. Margaret listened without moving. Dr. Hargrove slid a photograph across the table. Her combat boots. The worn pair from her locker. Tan leather, scuffed at the heel, a small tear near the left ankle where shrapnel had caught her in a convoy outside Sanjin Valley, Helmand Province. The investigator leaned forward. These were found during a routine locker search, she said, her pen hovering over her notebook. They don't match any issued equipment from any nursing program. Your hiring paperwork shows no military service. No deployment records. No honorable discharge documentation. The attorney's voice was clinical, almost apologetic. Stolen valor is a federal crime, Ms. Walsh. We have a responsibility to report this to the appropriate authorities. Margaret looked at the boots. Looked at Hargrove. His fingers were steepled on the table, elbows planted like a man preparing for war. Those boots are mine, Margaret said. Her voice was steady. Level. The kind of calm that comes from having already survived worse. One tear tracked down her left cheek, not fear, not anger, something older. Something like grief for the 3 years of invisibility she'd just lost. She wiped it away with the back of her hand, her eyes never leaving Hargrove's. The attorney shifted in his seat, uncomfortable with her composure. The investigator made a note. Hargrove's smirk wavered for a fraction of a second, which was enough. The chief nursing officer announced that Margaret was suspended effective immediately, pending the outcome of the investigation. All hospital privileges revoked. All patient contact prohibited. A final paycheck would be mailed. The investigator would be contacting references and previous employers. There were policy violations being documented, unauthorized procedures during that code with the Coast Guard commander, insubordination toward attending physicians, inconsistencies in her employment gaps. Hargrove had constructed the binder like a courtroom exhibit. Each page labeled. Each violation photographed or photocopied. Dates highlighted. His handwriting in the margins. She could smell the ink from the printer, sharp and chemical, cutting through the antiseptic air of the office. Security was called. 2 uniformed officers, neither of whom she recognized from her time on night shift. They entered with the mechanical precision of men who had done this before. Escorted her out. That was the protocol. That was how you removed someone from a hospital, not quietly, not at night, but during day shift change when the lobby was crowded with visiting families and afternoon nurses clocking in and orderlies pushing meal carts. They walked her through the doors past her colleagues. Dr. Chen stood frozen by the elevator, his hand halfway to the button, watching. Nurse Rodriguez turned away. The volunteers at the information desk pretended to be very focused on their computer screens. Dr. Hargrove watched from the second-floor balcony, his arms crossed, that smirk still in place like a wound that wouldn't close. That evening, Margaret sat in the waiting room of the Savannah Veterans Affairs Hospital on Victory Drive, 3 miles from Sacred Heart, and it was like sitting in a mirror of herself. The walls were institutional beige. The lighting fluorescent. The smell of antiseptic and old coffee and the particular exhaustion that accumulates in spaces where broken people wait for help. She was one of them now. A patient. Not a provider? The intake form was in her hands, the pen trembling slightly, not fear, not weakness, but the tremor of a body running on adrenaline and nothing else, the tremor of restraint finally reaching its limit. The form asked for her name, her service dates, her branch of service, her rank. It asked why she was seeking care. The blank line under reason for visit seemed to stretch across the page like a runway. PTSD. Post-traumatic stress disorder. the clinical term for what Helmand Province had left inside her chest. The 3 tours. The 127 combat saves documented in a military file that existed in a sealed folder somewhere in the Pentagon, a file that had been her entire identity for 12 years and had become something worse, a liability, a secret, a weapon in Hargrove's hands. She looked around the waiting room. An older veteran with a prosthetic leg. A younger man, maybe 30, staring at nothing. A woman her age reading a magazine without turning any pages. These were people she might have treated. People who had come to the VA after their own wars ended. People who understood the cost of invisibility. She clutched the pen and couldn't write. Her hands that had held together lacerated arteries under fire, hands that had performed needle decompression at 3 in the morning in a trauma bay while a man's lungs were collapsing, her hands couldn't write her own name on a form. The waiting room clock showed 6:43 p.m. Outside the windows, Savannah's heat was finally breaking, the evening cooling toward something almost bearable. She thought about the apartment she'd rented under a name that wasn't her original name, the quiet life she'd constructed, the absolute nothing she'd told anyone about where she'd come from or what she'd done. She'd walked away from the military because the weight of every life she couldn't save in Helmand had finally crushed something inside her that wasn't meant to be broken by a single event. It required the accumulation of 127 saves and the impossible weight of everyone she hadn't saved in time. She'd changed her name on unofficial documents. She'd taken the nursing job at Sacred Heart to disappear and heal in anonymity, to become invisible, to matter to no one in a way that meant no one could hurt her again. She'd told no one where she'd gone. Not her former commanding officers. Not the military friends who had tried to stay in touch. Not even her daughter, who was apparently now a lieutenant in the Coast Guard, which meant somewhere in the last 3 years Sarah had made life decisions that didn't include knowing where her mother worked. The intake form stayed blank. Margaret set down the pen. She sat in that waiting room surrounded by veterans and said nothing at all, because what could she possibly say that would fit in the boxes provided by the system? The fluorescent lights hummed their insect-trapped sound. The clock moved to 6:44. And somewhere across the city, Dr. Hargrove was likely at home, his smirk finally fading into sleep, believing he'd won. But he had no idea what was already in motion. He had no idea that the Coast Guard commander he'd tried to crucify through Margaret, that man was already awake in his hospital bed, already asking questions, already learning the name of the nurse who had saved his life and disappeared like smoke. Commander Riker's eyes snapped open at 6:56 a.m. on the 3rd morning after surgery. The ICU ceiling tiles blurred into focus. His chest burned where the needle had gone in, where she had saved his life, where the anesthesiologist had whispered that single word, Valkyrie. He'd spent the last 18 hours asking nurses for her name. Nobody answered. The nurses looked away. The residents pretended not to hear. But Commander Riker had spent 23 years in the Coast Guard learning to read silence, and the silence around this particular nurse was loaded with something heavy, something official, something wrong. He ripped the oxygen monitor from his finger. The alarm shrieked. Nurses appeared in his doorway within seconds, but he was already sitting up, already moving, already pulling the 4 from his arm with the kind of decisive precision that came from a life spent giving orders in crisis. "Get me a wheelchair." It wasn't a request. It was a command. "Commander, you need to rest." The administrative wing. Now. 30 minutes later, he was being wheeled down the 3rd-floor corridor, his fustand trailing behind like a reluctant ghost, his surgical incision aching with every bump of the wheelchair over the tile floor. His aide had made phone calls. His aide had learned that a nurse, Margaret something, nobody would give a full name, had been terminated that morning. Fired. Gone. The woman who'd performed a flawless needle decompression at the 2nd intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, had been escorted out of the building like a criminal. The conference room door was closed. Through the frosted glass, he could see silhouettes. He could hear Dr. Hargrove's voice, smooth and practiced, already spinning the narrative. The aide wheeled him forward. The door opened. The room went dead silent. Hargrove was mid-sentence, a leather binder open in front of him, 3 board members flanking him like an honor guard. Margaret Walsh stood at the opposite end of the table, her hand steady at her sides, her eyes meeting no one's gaze, not defiant, not broken, just present. Just still. Commander Riker's eyes locked onto hers across that conference table, and he whispered one word through the silence. Valkyrie. Her head turned. Their eyes met. Something flickered across her face, not recognition, not exactly, but acknowledgement. The kind of acknowledgement that comes when someone from your past suddenly stands in the present, calling you by a name nobody should know. The door opened again. A woman in a Coast Guard dress uniform stepped through, insignia sharp as broken glass, her bearing the kind of straight that only comes from military bearing drilled into the spine for decades. Her eyes went to Margaret's face, and something shifted in the room like a fault line moving. That Senior Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh. The woman's voice was steady, formal, the voice of someone who had been waiting a very long time to say those words out loud. I'm Lieutenant Sarah Walsh, United States Coast Guard. She's my mother. Dr. Hargrove's face drained of color. His mouth opened and closed like something dying on the deck of a ship. A nurse entered holding a sealed file folder, her hands trembling so visibly that the folder shook against her chest. She opened it. She began to read. Her voice cracked on the second line. 3 tours of duty. Helmand Province. 2nd tour, combat operations. 3rd tour, medical evacuation squadron. The nurse's voice steadied slightly. Combat saves, 127. Deployment duration, 3 years, 4 months. The nurse looked up at Margaret, and tears were running down her face. You saved 127 people. The room didn't move. The room didn't breathe. A video call activated on the conference room monitor. A face appeared, weathered, scarred, the kind of face that had seen what cannot be unseen. A Navy SEAL unit leader, insignia visible on his uniform collar, his jaw working like he was chewing on words too heavy to speak. I served with Senior Chief Walsh in Task Force 3-1, Sanjin Valley. His voice came through the speaker system like a transmission from another world. Bronze Star for heroism. Silver Star for valorous action under fire. 2nd Silver Star for a medevac insertion under indirect fire that saved my entire team. He paused. A visible swallow. Purple Heart from shrapnel wound sustained during that insertion. 2nd Purple Heart from a blast concussion that fractured her left radius. He looked directly at the camera. And a Navy Cross. The Navy Cross, which means she faced imminent death and chose someone else's life anyway. That's who you're firing. Hargrove stood up. This is highly irregular, I had no way of knowing, her application clearly stated. The door opened. A Coast Guard Rear Admiral entered the room, his presence alone enough to flatten the air pressure. He was tall, his uniform creased into geometry, his eyes the color of a storm system moving across open water. His name tag read Chen. He walked directly to Dr. Hargrove and stopped exactly 18 inches away. I am Rear Admiral Chen. Yes, relation to your anesthesiologist, who happens to be my nephew. His voice was quiet, the kind of quiet that comes from absolute authority having no need to project. He called me 36 hours ago because he recognized your nurse's technique. He knew what he'd witnessed. So I've spent the last 36 hours reviewing this situation in detail. Hargrove tried to speak. The Admiral raised one hand. You knowingly discredited a decorated service member to the hospital board. You fabricated a binder of policy violations. You used an investigator to weaponize her military service record against her. You confiscated her personal property as evidence of stolen valor. And you did all of it because she questioned your protocol during a code blue. The Admiral's eyes didn't blink. She was right. Your protocol was wrong. The patient survived because she was faster and smarter than you. You couldn't accept that. Sarah Walsh stepped forward, moving to stand beside her mother. Their shoulders nearly touching. Their stance suddenly identical, the same posture, the same set of the jaw, The kind of stillness that comes from having survived things most people can't imagine. She left active duty 3 years ago without telling me where she was going, Sarah said, her voice steady as stone. No forwarding address. No contact. I spent 3 years looking for her because I thought something was wrong. I thought she was hurt. I thought she was gone. Sarah's eyes went to Hargrove. She was protecting us. Protecting herself. Healing in private because the weight of everything she'd carried was crushing her. And you made it your mission to destroy her the moment she questioned your authority. The hospital board chair stood. He was an older man, his face carrying the weight of someone who understood institutional failure when he saw it. His voice carried the finality of a judge handing down sentence. Dr. Hargrove, you are terminated effective immediately for knowingly discrediting a decorated service member, for fabricating evidence, and for gross abuse of institutional authority. You will surrender your hospital credentials, your access badges, and your parking pass. Security will escort you from the premises. The Admiral gestured to the doorway, where 2 security officers were already standing. And Dr. Hargrove. The Admiral's voice cut through the silence like a blade. The local news is in the lobby. My office alerted them 40 minutes ago. You'll be exiting through the main entrance during shift change. There are approximately 200 hospital staff members currently gathering in the main hallway. Camera crews are rolling. You'll have to walk through all of them. The color drained from Hargrove's face. Not pale, actually grey, the color of something already dead. He stood on shaking legs. His hands fumbled with his binder. One of his residents, the young attending who'd laughed the loudest when Hargrove knocked Margaret's cafeteria tray to the floor, wouldn't meet his eyes. The charge nurse who'd witnessed every humiliation took a deliberate step back as he passed. The security officers flanked him. The walk to the elevator felt like a death march. When the doors opened to the main floor, the hallway was lined. Staff on both sides, standing in silence. No applause. No jeers. Just the weight of collective witnessing. The clicking of camera shutters echoed off the hospital walls like gunfire in a canyon. Someone had retrieved Margaret's combat boots from evidence. Someone, the anesthesiologist, maybe, or Commander Riker's aide, had placed them in the hands of Commander Riker, who held them up as Hargrove passed, the worn leather catching the hospital lights, each scuff mark a story of a mission that mattered more than pride. Hargrove looked down at his shoes. He didn't look up again until he reached the parking lot. 6 months later, Sacred Heart Hospital held a rededication ceremony for the new trauma wing. The wing's official name, the Margaret Walsh Center for Combat Transition Medicine. The wing's purpose, to train transitioning service members in civilian emergency nursing, led by someone who understood both worlds, who had lived in both, who had paid for both with blood and scar tissue and 3 years of isolation. Margaret Walsh stood in her Coast Guard dress uniform. The uniform fit perfectly, the way uniforms do when you've worn them long enough that they become a second skin. Her medals were displayed on her chest in order: Bronze Star, Silver Star, Second Silver Star, Navy Cross mounted last, the way military protocol demands, the way recognition escalates in geometric progression. Her left arm bore the physical scar from Sanjin Valley, a thin white line from wrist to elbow, visible where the dress uniform's short sleeves left it exposed. Behind her, mounted in a glass case with museum lighting, were her old combat boots. The ones that had been confiscated. The ones that had become evidence of heroism instead of fraud. A plaque beneath them read, Senior Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh. 127 lives saved. Helmand Province. United States Coast Guard. Lieutenant Sarah Walsh stood beside her mother, her own uniform crisp and sharp, her eyes moving from the boots to Margaret's face and back again. Their relationship was still rebuilding. Still fragile in places. But rebuilding. Sarah had tracked down the base where Margaret had been stationed after leaving Savannah. Had made a call. Had started the process of understanding why her mother had disappeared instead of coming home. Commander Riker approached with his hand extended. He was moving without his cane now, his surgical incision healed to the point where mobility had returned. he presented Margaret with the hospital's first ever Valor in Medicine award, a bronze sculpture of a nurse holding a compass, the symbolism so obvious that nobody had to explain it. "You found the North," he said quietly, just loud enough for Sarah to hear. "When you were lost, you saved people instead of falling apart. That's not nursing. That's command." During the reception, someone mentioned Hargrove's name in Margaret's hearing. The hospital administrator's face tightened. "Last I heard," Dr. Chen said, appearing beside Margaret with a drink in his hand, "is teaching CPR at a community college in Tallahassee for minimum wage. His medical license is under review in 3 states. His malpractice insurance dropped him. His teaching people how to save lives. He's no longer qualified to practice saving." Margaret nodded. She wasn't interested in Hargrove anymore. Hargrove was aftermath. Hargrove was the noise that happens when someone falls away from power. She stood by the glass case, looking at her old boots, feeling the weight of her uniform on her shoulders, a weight that no longer crushed her. A weight that felt like home. Sarah touched her shoulder. "Mom? You okay?" Margaret nodded. Took a breath. Actually took a breath without the weight crushing her chest. "I spent 3 years hiding who I was because I thought the person I'd been was broken. Turns out she was just healing." That evening, Margaret led her first training session for the new Combat to Civilian nursing program. 15 veterans sat in the classroom, all with careful eyes, all with hands that trembled slightly when they thought nobody was looking. Margaret understood those tremors. She'd lived inside those tremors. She wrote on the whiteboard in blue marker, "True class is what you do when the lights go out." One veteran raised his hand. He was a former Army medic, his face carrying the specific exhaustion that comes from having seen too much. "Senior Chief? What does that mean?" Margaret smiled. A real smile. For the first time in 3 years, a smile that reached her eyes without having to calculate it. "It means nobody's watching when you make the choice to save a life. You do it anyway. Every single time. Not for medals. Not for recognition. You do it because you're the kind of person who can't do anything else." The veteran nodded. He understood. They all understood. In that room full of broken people learning to heal while helping others, nobody needed it explained any further. If you've made it this far, you already know, sometimes the person you're standing next to has already survived what you're terrified of. Subscribe for more stories of quiet heroism. Like and comment below if you've ever been underestimated by someone who had no idea who you really were. These stories matter. They deserve to be heard.